Gene Vincent died with one good leg and a million regrets. But rock and roll was born from his pain. October 12, 1971. Newhall, California. Gene Vincent dies with one good leg, a bottle of whiskey, and the ghost of Eddie Cochran sitting at his bedside. The man who proved that rebellion could come from weakness now takes his final breath in a hospital room that smells of disinfectant and defeat, his mangled left leg finally free from the agony that had defined 20 years of his life. Pain was my companion, the stage my salvation. This is Gene Vincent, the limping legend who showed the world that rock and roll wasn't about perfection. It was about surviving what tried to kill you and turning that survival into a sound that could wake the dead. In America, he died as Elvis's failed shadow. In England, he was the dark lord of rock and roll, proof that the most dangerous performers are the ones with nothing left to lose. When news of Gene's death reaches the music world, the response reveals the strange geography of his fame. In America, the obituaries are brief, a footnote about a forgotten rocker who never lived up to Elvis's shadow. But in England, fans gather in the streets, treating his death like the end of an era. The BBC interrupts programming to play Be-Bop-A-Lula. The man who couldn't make it in his own country had become a god to kids who understood that rock and roll was supposed to hurt. How does someone who created one of the most influential songs in rock history end up dying alone and broke? Was Gene Vincent's legendary wildness a triumph of spirit over circumstance? Or was it perhaps the most elaborate form of suicide ever performed on stage? But to understand how a crippled sailor from Virginia became the godfather of punk rock, we must first understand how pain became his first instrument, and how learning to hide weakness taught him to weaponize rebellion. Norfolk, Virginia, 1935, Vincent Eugene Craddock was born into a world where men were expected to be strong, silent, and capable of enduring whatever life threw at them without complaint. The Craddock household was military-minded and working class, where his father's service in the Navy provided both structure and expectation that Vincent would follow in his footsteps. Even as a child, Vincent possessed an unusual combination of physical restlessness and emotional intensity that would define his entire career. He was drawn to loud noises, fast movements, and anything that could drown out the mundane reality of small-town Virginia life. His teachers described him as bright but unfocused, someone who seemed to be listening for sounds that nobody else could hear. The Craddock family lived in a modest house near the naval base, where the sounds of military life, barked orders, marching feet, ship horns, created a constant soundtrack of discipline and purpose. Vincent absorbed these rhythms, but they competed with something wilder in his blood, a restlessness that would eventually find expression in the driving beat of rock and roll. His mother, Mary Louise, recognized her son's musical ability early, but worried about the intensity that accompanied it. When Vincent played guitar, he seemed to disappear into the instrument. His usual fidgety energy transformed into laser focus that was both impressive and slightly unsettling. "He doesn't just play music," she confided to neighbors. "He lives inside it." Music became his escape route from a world that felt too small and too quiet for whatever was burning inside him. He learned guitar not as a hobby but as a necessity, discovering that 6 strings and an amplifier could transform his restless energy into something that other people actually wanted to experience. By his teenage years, he was already performing with local bands, developing a stage presence that was equal parts charm and barely controlled chaos. His decision to join the Navy in 1952 seemed natural given his family background. But it also represented an attempt to channel his wild energy into socially acceptable forms. Military service appealed to his need for structure and adventure, but it also placed him in situations where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. The discipline he learned in the service would serve him well in the recording studio, but the risk-taking mentality that made him a good sailor would nearly destroy him as a civilian. During his Navy years, Vincent began developing the persona that would later become Gene Vincent. On base, he was Vincent Craddock, disciplined, reliable, following orders without question. But on weekend leave, he transformed into something different, a performer who could command attention through sheer force of personality and musical talent. He was learning to live in two worlds simultaneously, a skill that would prove both essential and dangerous in his rock and roll career. The contradiction that would define his entire life was already visible during his military years. He could follow orders and maintain discipline when required, but he also possessed an anarchic spirit that chafed against any kind of limitation. This tension between conformity and rebellion would later fuel his most powerful performances, but it also created internal pressures that he would never learn to manage in healthy ways. His early musical influences were as contradictory as his personality. He absorbed country music's storytelling traditions, rhythm and blues' sexual energy, and pop music's commercial appeal, creating a personal style that didn't fit neatly into any existing category. This musical restlessness would later help him pioneer rockabilly, but it also made him difficult to market and promote in an industry that preferred its artists to stay in clearly defined lanes. Could this early experience of living between different identities have shaped Gene's legendary ability to transform pain into performance? Was he already learning that in a world that demanded conformity, the most powerful thing you could do was refuse to be easily categorized? The motorcycle accident that changed everything happened on July 4, 1955, Independence Day, a detail that would later seem like dark prophecy. 20-year-old Vincent Craddock was riding his Triumph motorcycle through the streets of Norfolk when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into him, crushing his left leg so badly that doctors initially recommended amputation. The decision to save his leg rather than amputate it was the first of many choices that would define his transformation from Vincent Craddock into Gene Vincent. One good leg and a lifetime of pain. The months of surgery, rehabilitation, and constant agony that followed taught him that his body would never again be reliable. But they also taught him that performance could overcome physical limitation in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. The kids didn't see the limp, they just heard the beat. But Gene felt everything, the sharp stab with every step, the weight of pills in his pocket, the knowledge that he would never again move through the world without announcing his damage to anyone who cared to look. Yet somehow, this limitation became liberation. This weakness transformed into the distinctive swagger that no healthy performer could replicate. His transformation into Gene Vincent began during those long months of recovery, when he had nothing to do but listen to music and dream about escape from a life that suddenly seemed much more fragile than he had ever imagined. The accident had shown him that he was mortal, but it had also shown him that survival was a choice he would have to make every single day. The physical therapy sessions were brutal, forcing him to relearn basic movements while fighting constant pain. But they also provided a strange education in the relationship between limitation and creativity. When traditional walking became impossible, he developed the distinctive swagger that would later become his trademark. When running was no longer an option, he learned to channel that kinetic energy into his guitar playing and stage presence. The name change from Vincent Craddock to Gene Vincent was symbolic of more than just career ambition. It represented his decision to become someone who could transform weakness into strength, limitation into liberation, pain into the kind of performance that could change people's lives. The man who emerged from the hospital was fundamentally different from the one who had gone in. Harder, more desperate, but also more authentically connected to the emotions that would fuel his greatest music. His first professional recording session came just months after he was released from the hospital. when Capitol Records talent scout Ken Nelson discovered him performing in a Norfolk club. The label was looking for someone who could compete with Elvis Presley's growing popularity. But what they found in Gene Vincent was something entirely different. Not a polished entertainer, but a wounded animal who could channel his pain into sounds that no healthy person could make. The chemistry between Gene and producer Ken Nelson was immediate and electric. Nelson understood that Gene's damaged leg wasn't just a physical limitation, it was a source of rhythmic innovation. The way Gene had learned to move, compensating for his injury, created a distinctive timing that influenced everything from his vocal phrasing to his guitar playing. They were pioneering a sound that would later be called rockabilly, but at the time it felt like they were inventing something completely new. The recording of Be-Bop-A-Lula in May 1956 was lightning captured in a bottle, a perfect storm of talent, desperation, and technological innovation that created one of the most influential recordings in rock and roll history. Gene's vocals on the track were simultaneously smooth and ragged, controlled and chaotic, revealing a performer who had learned to use his damage as his greatest artistic asset. The song itself was born from limitations. Gene couldn't move around the studio the way other performers could, so he had to pour all his energy into his voice and the small movements he could manage. The result was a recording that felt both intimate and explosive, as if the listener was experiencing something private that had been amplified to mythic proportions. Was the accident that nearly killed him actually the birth of Gene Vincent as an artist? Did learning to perform through pain teach him something about authenticity that more comfortable performers never discovered? Be-Bop-A-Lula exploded across American radio in the summer of 1956, establishing Gene Vincent and his band the Blue Caps as major players in the emerging rockabilly scene. The song's success was immediate and massive, reaching number 7 on the Billboard charts and establishing Gene as one of the few performers who could legitimately challenge Elvis Presley's dominance of rock and roll. But even at the height of his initial success, there were signs that Gene's approach to fame would be fundamentally different from his more stable contemporaries. Where Elvis learned to manage his image and control his public persona, Gene remained essentially unchanged by success. Still drinking too much, still taking dangerous risks, still using his pain as the primary source of his artistic power. His live performances during this period were legendary for their intensity and unpredictability. Gene would take the stage in black leather, his limp barely visible until he began to move, transforming his disability into a distinctive dance that was equal parts swagger and struggle. The kids didn't see the limp, they just heard the beat, but that beat carried something darker than Elvis's hip-shaking optimism. It carried the sound of someone who had already been broken and put back together with different parts. The Blue Caps, lead guitarist Cliff Gallup, bassist Jack Neal, drummer Dickie Harrell, and rhythm guitarist Willie Williams, were more than just his backing band. They were his artistic family, a group of musicians who understood that Gene's limitations actually created new possibilities for rock and roll sound. Gallup's guitar work in particular was revolutionary, creating riffs and solos that seemed to dance around Gene's vocal delivery in ways that perfectly complemented his damaged swagger. The success of Be-Bop-A-Lula opened doors throughout the entertainment industry, but it also created expectations that Gene would prove increasingly unable to meet. Record executives wanted him to repeat his initial success with similar songs, but Gene's musical interests were too restless, and his personal demons too complex for such simple commercial calculations. Each subsequent recording revealed an artist who was more interested in exploring the darker corners of human experience than in maintaining his position on the charts. Songs like Race with the Devil and Blue John Bop showcased the evolution of his sound, harder, more aggressive, more obviously influenced by the chronic pain that had become his constant companion. These recordings were commercial disappointments compared to his breakthrough hit, but they revealed an artist who was pushing rock and roll into territories that wouldn't be fully explored until the punk movement of the 1970s. His relationship with his band was both collaborative and volatile. The musicians respected his talent and were excited by the opportunities his success created. But they also struggled to cope with his unpredictable behavior and increasing dependence on alcohol as a way of managing both his physical pain and his emotional turmoil. The band became both his artistic family and his enablers, supporting his creativity while inadvertently encouraging the self-destructive tendencies that would eventually overwhelm him. The touring schedule that accompanied his chart success was brutal even by rock and roll standards. Gene performed nearly every night for months at a time, traveling between cities in cars and buses that provided little comfort for his injured leg. The constant travel, combined with his refusal to limit his alcohol consumption or moderate his stage performances, created a cycle of pain and medication that was already becoming dangerous by the end of 1956. But perhaps most significantly, his early success established a pattern of using performance as a way of avoiding the psychological and physical realities of his condition. On stage, the pain disappeared, transformed into energy that could electrify an audience. Off stage, the pain returned doubled, requiring increasingly large amounts of alcohol and eventually prescription drugs to make bearable. The critics who reviewed his performances during this period struggled to categorize what they were witnessing. Gene Vincent wasn't just entertaining audiences. He was conducting some kind of ritual transformation, turning his own damage into a communal experience that left audiences both exhilarated and slightly unsettled. He was proving that rock and roll could be more than entertainment. It could be a form of shared catharsis, a way of transforming individual pain into collective energy. By 1959, Gene Vincent's career in America was already in decline, but his influence was spreading internationally in ways that would prove far more lasting than his domestic commercial success. The rise of more polished rock and roll performers and the music industry's increasing preference for safe, marketable artists had pushed Gene's brand of dangerous authenticity to the margins of American popular culture. But in England, Gene Vincent was becoming something approaching a religious figure. British teenagers, constrained by their own country's social conformity and cultural limitations, responded to Gene's music with an intensity that American audiences had never shown. His limp, his leather clothes, his obvious pain, and his refusal to soften his edges for commercial success made him a perfect symbol for kids who felt trapped by their own circumstances. The invitation to tour England in 1960 represented both a career opportunity and a form of artistic salvation for Gene. After years of declining record sales and increasingly sparse American bookings, the chance to perform for audiences who understood and appreciated his music felt like a lifeline. He assembled a tour package that included Eddie Cochran and several other American rockers, planning what they all hoped would be a triumphant international expansion of their careers. Eddie Cochran's inclusion in the tour was both blessing and curse for Gene. Cochran was everything that Gene was not: young, healthy, optimistic about the future of rock and roll, and blessed with a natural charm that made him beloved by fans and industry professionals alike. Their friendship was genuine and based on mutual musical respect, but it also highlighted everything that Gene's accident had taken away from him. The psychological weight of being the crippled rocker in a genre that celebrated physical vitality and youth was taking its toll in ways that Gene had never anticipated. While audiences saw his limp as part of his rebellious image, Gene experienced it as a daily reminder of everything he had lost and could never recover. The constant comparison to healthier performers, especially Eddie Cochran, created a form of survivor's guilt that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The early shows of the tour were everything Gene had hoped they would be. British audiences responded to his performances with an enthusiasm that reminded him why he had started making music in the first place. The pain that had become such a burden in America was transformed back into power when faced with crowds who saw his struggle as authenticity rather than limitation. But the success of the tour was overshadowed by personal tensions that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Gene's drinking had escalated to levels that worried even his most tolerant friends and colleagues. His chronic pain, exacerbated by the physical demands of nightly performances and constant travel, required ever-increasing amounts of medication to manage. Most troubling, his relationship with Eddie Cochran was becoming strained by Gene's growing resentment of his friend's health, youth, and seemingly effortless success. The contrast between the two performers was stark and painful for Gene to observe night after night. Where Eddie moved across the stage with natural grace and energy, Gene had to carefully plan every movement to minimize pain and avoid embarrassing falls. Where Eddie charmed audiences with his youthful optimism, Gene commanded them through sheer force of will and barely controlled desperation. British music journalists, covering the tour with an enthusiasm that their American counterparts had never shown, began to write about Gene Vincent as something more than just a rock and roll performer. They saw him as a symbol of authentic rebellion, someone who had refused to compromise his artistic vision despite enormous personal and professional pressures. The British press was creating a mythology around Gene that would outlast his actual career, establishing him as a foundational figure in what would later become punk rock. The kids didn't see the limp, they just heard the beat. But backstage, the reality was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Gene was consuming dangerous amounts of alcohol and prescription painkillers. His behavior was becoming erratic and unpredictable, and his relationship with Eddie Cochran was deteriorating under the weight of unspoken resentments and misunderstood loyalties. April 17, 1960. The A4 highway outside London, the night when rock and roll lost its golden boy and kept its wounded soldier. Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran were traveling between shows when their taxi crashed. A tire blowout at high speed, the kind of random mechanical failure that could happen to anyone. But its consequences were catastrophic. The sound of breaking glass mixed with the splintering of a guitar case. Eddie Cochran, 21 years old and at the peak of his career, died from his injuries 3 days later. Gene Vincent survived with additional damage to his already mangled leg. One good leg, and survivor's guilt heavier than lead. It should have been me. Those 4 words would echo in Gene's mind for the remaining 11 years of his life. Why had he survived when someone younger, more talented, and more beloved had died? The question haunted him through months of physical recovery, and would continue to torment him until his own death. The accident had taken away his closest friend and left him with the impossible burden of representing both his own damaged career and Eddie's unfulfilled potential. From that night forward, every performance became a memorial service, every song a prayer for the dead. Gene started drinking not just to numb the pain in his leg, but to silence the voice in his head that whispered he should have died instead of Eddie. The kids still didn't see the limp, they just heard the beat. But now that beat carried the weight of 2 men's dreams and 1 man's guilt. Did this tragic night mark the beginning of Gene's final downward spiral? Or was it simply the moment when his long-standing self-destructive tendencies finally found an excuse to flourish? The decade following Eddie Cochran's death was a slow-motion catastrophe that played out on stages across Europe and America, as Gene Vincent gradually drank and drugged himself toward the grave, while maintaining enough professional competence to keep working. His performances during this period were marked by an intensity that bordered on desperation, as if he were trying to sing loudly enough to wake the dead, or to drown out the voices in his head that reminded him daily of his friend's absence. His return to America after the accident was a bitter disappointment. The rock and roll landscape had changed dramatically during his absence, and there was little room for a performer whose best days seemed behind him, and whose personal problems were becoming increasingly obvious to industry professionals. Record labels were reluctant to work with someone whose reliability was questionable and whose commercial prospects appeared limited. The America that Gene returned to in 1960 was already moving away from the raw, dangerous sound that had made him famous. The music industry was embracing more polished performers, teen idols with safe images and manageable personalities. Gene's combination of genuine damage and unpredictable behavior was exactly what the industry was trying to avoid. But rather than adapting to changing musical tastes or seeking help for his growing addiction problems, Gene doubled down on the self-destructive behaviors that were slowly killing him. He drank to numb the physical pain in his leg, to quiet the emotional pain of survivor's guilt, and to maintain the rebellious image that had made him famous but was now trapping him in a performance of his own destruction. His later recordings, while often musically sophisticated and emotionally powerful, were made under increasingly difficult circumstances. Studio musicians described sessions where Gene would arrive hours late, barely able to stand, but somehow capable of delivering vocals that captured emotions too complex for healthy people to understand. His voice during this period was simultaneously his greatest artistic asset and the clearest evidence of his deteriorating condition. The few loyal fans who continued to follow his career were witnessing something unprecedented in popular music. An artist who was literally dying in public, using his own decay as raw material for performances that were both magnificent and horrible to experience. Gene had become a living example of rock and roll's capacity for both transcendence and destruction, proving that the same forces that could create timeless art could also consume the people who channeled them. His live performances during this period were exercises in controlled catastrophe. He would take the stage already half drunk, his movements even more limited than usual, but somehow transform his deterioration into a form of dark charisma that was impossible to ignore. Audiences came to see Gene Vincent not because they expected to be entertained, but because they wanted to witness something real and dangerous in an increasingly sanitized musical landscape. The kids still didn't see the limp, they just heard the beat. But now that beat carried the weight of genuine tragedy, the sound of someone who had stopped fighting his demons and started inviting them on stage with him. His performances became less about music and more about endurance. How long could he stand? How long could he sing? How long could he maintain the illusion that he was still the dangerous rebel who had once challenged Elvis Presley's dominance of rock and roll? His financial situation during this period was constantly precarious. The royalties from Be-Bop-A-Lula provided some income, but his inability to maintain steady work and his expensive habits created a cycle of debt and desperation that made artistic growth nearly impossible. He was trapped in a profession that demanded physical and emotional resources he no longer possessed, but he had no other skills and no other identity beyond being Gene Vincent. Perhaps most tragically, his few attempts to get clean and rebuild his career were undermined by his inability to separate his artistry from his self-destruction. The pain and chaos that were killing him were also the sources of his most powerful performances, creating an impossible choice between health and authenticity that he was never able to resolve. The alcohol that had once helped him cope with physical pain had become a master that controlled every aspect of his existence. Friends from this period described a man who was charming and intelligent when sober, but increasingly unpredictable and dangerous when drunk. The personality that had once made him a compelling performer was being gradually erased by chemical dependency. October 12, 1971, Newhall, California. Gene Vincent's final day began like most others during his last years, with pain medication, cheap whiskey, and the growing certainty that his body could no longer sustain the punishment he had been inflicting on it for decades. One good leg and a million regrets. The hospital room where he died was a far cry from the stages where he had once commanded thousands of fans. There were no leather clothes, no screaming guitars, no crowds of teenagers discovering that rebellion could be beautiful. Just a man in his 30s who looked 20 years older, surrounded by medical equipment that couldn't repair the damage he had done to himself in the name of rock and roll authenticity. His final words, spoken to a nurse who had been kind to him during his last hospitalization, were characteristically self-deprecating. "I didn't invent rock and roll, I just sang it like my life depended on it." He died as he had lived since 1960, carrying Eddie Cochran's ghost on his shoulders, survivor's guilt finally winning the race with his damaged heart. In America, the obituaries were brief and often inaccurate, treating him as a footnote to the Elvis Presley story. But in England, fans gathered in record stores, understanding they had lost something irreplaceable. The wounded soldier who had shown them that rock and roll was supposed to hurt, that the most beautiful rebellion comes from those who have nothing left to lose. Gene Vincent proved that rock and roll is born from pain. But do we have to bleed to be believed? His legacy lives not in his damaged leg or his self-destruction, but in the beat that transcended both. The kids never saw the limp, they just heard the beat. And that beat, imperfect, painful, but undeniably alive, continues to prove that sometimes our greatest weakness becomes our most powerful gift, as long as we learn to use it without letting it consume us.